We're now going to jump ahead to 2016 and talk about where we're at with digital audio workstations today. In this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about that evolution, Pro Tools version 1 coming out in 91, 92. It's now the year 2016, so that's 24, 25 solid years of development for these programs. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're also really going to focus on this idea of finding the DAW that suits you the best. This isn't about picking something that's going to be the best for everyone, because that just wouldn't be the case. The thing that happens to suit me really well may not be the thing that is going to suit you really well. And what this comes down to is being able to make the music you want to make and being excited about making it. You might find that there's one DAW that just the look of it and the feel of it and clicking around really keeps you inspired. And if that's the case, that's probably what you want to go with. It's not just what offers you the most features. It's not about what's the most expensive. It's about making the music that you want to make, being able to do that. So keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this presentation. For this course specifically, it is highly recommended. In fact, it's kind of required that you do have a DAW that is capable of hosting and running a 64-bit VST or AU plugins. The reason being, in this course, we're only going to be using 64-bit plugins. At one time, I was going to do a mix of like 32 and 64-bit, but I realized that with most modern DAWs today, they're all capable of handling 64-bit. They're not all going to be capable of handling 32-bit, so that's the direction we're going in. Other things that I'd highly encourage is that your DAW has unlimited tracks, so you can put down as many audio or instrument tracks as you want, and also that you have unlimited slots in space for plugins. Again, some freeware ones are going to block you at a certain point, and that's okay because with most of these programs, you can still bounce down. You're going to be kind of doing like the Beatles trick. You're going to have your tracks and then bounce down and then add more tracks and bounce down, which is okay, but it can be kind of tedious and frustrating. And at this point, if you've gone through the course where we use Soundation and Audio Tool and you're still really interested in making music, you might want to consider looking at the DAW as a long-term investment. So you're purchasing something that you're planning to use for many years to come. And specifically, if you have dreams or desires of being a professional at this stuff, you really want to spend extra time investing in the DAW that's best for you. And I say that because imagine purchasing a car. You spend a lot of time doing research and thinking about what is going to be the best car for me right now. And sometimes that's based on cost, sometimes that's based on model, on whatever it may be. And you're going to think about that really long and hard because it's a big purchase and it costs a lot of money. DAWs are a lot cheaper than a new car. However, I want you to kind of consider it the same way, because if you're a professional, you're going to be opening up that same program every single day for 5 to 6, sometimes 7, 8, 9 hours every single day. That's kind of a big deal. You're actually going to be using that more than you would be driving around a car. So just because it's cheaper, it doesn't mean that this decision isn't any more or less important. So if you are starting to get really interested and into this sort of thing, I would encourage that you actually lay down the money and buy something, because in theory, you only will ever need one DAW. It's not like you need to buy 10 different DAWs and you're going to be using them differently. No, you want to think of the DAW as that outer exterior shell with which everything else that you're using to make music is contained within. So you don't want to have 6 different shells to all be hosting the same sort of stuff. You want to have that one universal shell that's going to be holding everything. And since we already talked about Soundation and Audio Tool, which are free browser applications, very powerful, you can do a lot with them, but since we've already gone over those, I'm going to be using a commercial DAW in the actual presentation in the videos, mainly because I'm taking my own advice. I actually only have 2 DAW-like programs installed on this computer, and one of them came with it, which is GarageBand, which I don't even use. So I'm going to take my own advice and use what I'm most comfortable working in, but just because I'm using that program does not mean that it's the best. You may absolutely hate it. You might hate the way it works, the way it runs, and for that reason, I'm not encouraging anybody to pick it just because I'm using it. That is not the way I want you to be making your decision here at all, because what you choose makes no difference for this course as long as it is capable of hosting those 64-bit plugins, which is what we're all going to be using together. Right now, the built-in features, not important. A little bit about DAW Evolution. As we mentioned in the last video, it was 1999 when the first #1 hit was actually completely recorded, edited, and mixed inside of a software application inside of Pro Tools. It's now the year 2016, and there have been leaps and bounds of improvements with the actual software itself. And it's become much more feature rich. And I think it's important to realize that those features are coming about to accommodate the advanced users. They're not really necessarily coming out with new features for the person opening it up right out of the box. Nowadays, that's kind of a little bit more factored in. You know, they try to market to a bedroom producer and say, we're going to give you this number of instruments and whatever. And so that kind of gets you excited to buy it, and this number of drum samples. But for a long time, a lot of features that were added on specifically to something like Pro Tools was being done for people who like really needed them and used it every day. But for a beginner, if you open it up the first time, you see all these menus, it's really a daunting task. So we're going to kind of try to simplify that a little bit, only touch on what's really important and things that you're going to see in every single DAW if you really just want to kind of sit down and start making music. And it's important to also note that more features doesn't equal better music at all. It's just like with a program like Photoshop, for example. Just because you have the latest version of Photoshop and it has all of those features in there isn't going to suddenly make you a better photographer. And music production is exactly the same way. Just because you have the latest version of the most expensive and feature-laden program out there, you have every single plugin known to man, it doesn't make you a better musician, it doesn't make you a better artist, and it doesn't mean you're going to have better music. It's always more about the person sitting behind the controls. And the reason why we've been able to see so many of these advancements and new features is really comes down to advances in computing power. The fact that your computer is a lot quicker, it can do a lot more. Storage space is ridiculously cheap. You can buy like a terabyte external hard drive nowadays for like under $100. It's crazy. Even just 10 or 15 years ago, that would have been absurd. I mean, remember like when the PS4 first came out and it had like whatever that amount of data was, it was absurdly expensive. And then just 2 or 3 years later, the price was almost slashed in half, because that's just the way that technology goes, especially today with it developing so quickly, specifically with computing power. The DAW today also has gone beyond recording, editing, and mixing. You can now use the DAW as pretty much the creative hub for everything. You don't even necessarily need to record anything anymore. You can just use all things that have already been built in, samples inside of the computer. And one of the reasons for that has to do with studio cost. I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, you could go into a recording studio and easily pay $400 or $500 an hour, which really alienated a lot of people. And those people still wanted to make music, but they couldn't afford to do it in the studio. So software companies came along and said, hey, look, we can give you a much cheaper option right here. And so a lot of new artists took that opportunity and really learned it and got good at it. Studios and recording engineers and people really complain about that. However, they were not really willing to accommodate the average Joe back in the day. And actually nowadays, I'm just going to say this as an aside, if you are a band or something and it's in the budget, you probably still should go to a professional studio to record, because number one, you're going to be paying a heck of a lot less than you would have had to pay before. They'll now sometimes charge like even lower than $100 an hour, and they'll usually still have a very nice room to record in, acoustics wise, and also have a lot of different microphones to choose from and cabinets and things that you may not have at home. So it's probably worth it to record there, but then you could actually take those stems and mix it at home. That's now a possibility, when in the past that was just absolutely crazy to think about. And people even today are thinking about their computer as an instrument. I took a course in college, and it was I think 2011, and in that course we really were talking about using one particular software program to be our instrument. So we would go up there and perform live and do live improvisation, all that sort of thing, and use the computer as if it was our violin or our piano, or pick your instrument. So last but not least, we also have plugin development. And this has been, I guess, the most recent sort of evolution that's gotten just absolutely out of control. In the past, maybe you would still want to go into that professional studio because they had all of this old vintage gear and you could really color your sounds in ways that you just simply aren't going to be able to do at home. But the new trend has really been in the evolution of plugins. And if you're not aware of what a plugin is, basically you have your digital audio workstation that you're, making your music in, and then you can actually buy programs from third parties which you can run inside of your DAW to color your sound, manipulate it, do whatever you want with it. And that has been a huge growing market. And with the computing power increasing, the quality of these plugins, the performance of them, and the speed at which they're running has gotten so much better. It's really crazy to think about what plugins sounded like 10 years ago to what they sound like today. They're really just off the wall amazing. They're not the same as those analog counterparts that still exist in studios, but they are really cool sonic manipulation tools nonetheless. And so in this course, we're going to be using all freeware plugins because there are some fantastic and amazing freeware plugins that exist today that can get you very professional sounding results, again, if you know how to use them. Just for your information, as we go forward with this presentation, I'm only going to be listing a handful of DAWs that I would personally consider to be the most popular ones. They may not be the most popular ones, but in my opinion, they are. This does not mean they are the best ones, but what I will say about all of the DAWs that I'm going to list moving forward is that they have really good documentation, like manuals that you can go through and read and learn quite a bit just by going through the manual. And they also have a good amount of stuff that you can find online for free. So you can find a lot of good videos on YouTube or anywhere else. If you just search it out, there's usually a way that you're going to find the answer to the question you have relatively quickly. So that's kind of why I've picked these digital audio workstations. And it's not because I think they're necessarily the best. It's just because I know that they're good ones to pick, mainly because you're going to have a lot of additional help from other resources if you need it. So just the reasoning there. How important is the digital audio workstation? In my own opinion, after the chair that you're sitting in, which is important because you don't want to be uncomfortable, and the computer itself, the DAW is the most important part of your studio. And you might be thinking, that's crazy. What about the audio interface? What about the speakers? What about my headphones? What about the microphone? What about this, that, the other? I think the DAW is the most important thing nowadays because it's actually the thing that you see, you open, and you interact with the most on the day-to-day when you're making your music. All of those other things I mentioned before are very important, but they only get used in music making when you have the digital audio workstation open and running. So that is why I do believe the DAW, that external shell that's going to hold everything else, is so important. And it's why trying to pick the one that's going to suit you the best really does require a lot of careful consideration. So what's the difference between all these DAWs? We just saw that Wikipedia lists 37 different DAWs. There must be some really huge differences between all of them. But in reality, that's really not true. There's not so much of a difference between any of these digital audio workstations anymore. At a time, some of them could really do things that others couldn't. Nowadays, for the most part, they're all doing the same basic things, and sometimes just in different ways. So I think the better question you want to ask when you're trying to sort out all of these different DAWs and finding the one that's best for you is, what's the focus? What's the focus application of this program? And most DAWs, in my opinion, tend to have kind of a focus or primary use, or they're marketed towards a certain type of person. And if you classify yourself as that certain type of person, that DAW is really designed to help you, at least from their perspective. It may not be true, but that's at least their intention. That's what they're going for. So when you look at things like the interface, some of the functionality, what's built in, what it comes shipped with, how many samples, whatever, all of those things are usually based upon whatever the primary focus is of that digital audio workstation. So I've just gone ahead and listed out what I would say are the three main primary focuses today when you're picking a digital audio workstation, and a fourth that's kind of special, which is why it's down there and a little bit smaller in font size. So we have recording, mixing, creating, which nowadays creating has really kind of taken the forefront because it's almost as if recording and mixing are a little bit more of a given. And then the fourth one down there you see is live performance, which we'll talk about a little bit coming up. So for recording, pretty much every digital audio workstation can record multi-track, assuming you have an audio interface that can, support however many inputs it may have. All of them are going to be able to do that, and all of them will do it in maybe different ways. So some programs, if you're doing like a punch in, punch out, so you're recording like the same bar of audio again and again. Some of them kind of store it differently, but most of them will record every single take, and you'll be able to easily go in and access all of those to kind of find the best ones. But in my opinion, I'd say the programs that really do put recording to the forefront are programs like Pro Tools, Cubase, and Reaper. And just a small note on Pro Tools, because I know a lot of you coming in here and watching this video, you've probably been told, or you've probably heard, Pro Tools is the industry standard. If you hope to get a job in any music studio, you need to have a pretty good knowledge of Pro Tools. And from my perspective, in my opinion, I'd say that's both true and not true. Understanding Pro Tools is important, and if you're going to work in some of these older studios that are unwilling to adapt to any sort of change, you will be running and working inside of Pro Tools. However, the chances of you getting like a standard audio engineering job in a nice music studio nowadays is incredibly slim. The people who are in those positions are not going to leave them, and when they do leave them, it would be unlikely that that studio is going to be able to continue for a whole lot longer. And if you are working in maybe more of a newer upstart studio, they're going to be much more willing to listen to you and the ideas you have, because they know the struggle that the modern day studio is under. So if you come in there and say, hey, this program really works well, I think when artists come in, they're going to really kind of adapt and be drawn to this more than maybe Pro Tools, there's a chance that they might actually listen to you. In the past, they never would have, but I think nowadays people are starting to realize that the new breed of music producer is really younger people who adapted to the technology early on and really kind of keep up with it and understand it. So that's just my opinion. Pro Tools, it's good to have some working knowledge of it, but today in the industry, because the money's not flowing like it once was, there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of what you're working with. So Pro Tools, Cubase, Reaper, and I'd even say like older versions of Logic. So before you had Logic Pro 10, like Logic 8 and 9, those were also, there was an emphasis to actually recording multi-track like in a professional studio. For mixing, a little bit longer list here. Again, pretty much all of your programs are going to be able to mix the music. That's just kind of standard. That's the by default. But again, I would say you got Pro Tools, Cubase, Reaper, Studio One. Version 3 has become quite a popular thing. And then I'd also say Logic Pro 9 and earlier were really suited to professional mix engineers, just based on the layout of it, just based on some of like the metering things and tools. So if you're really into mixing, or you are thinking about getting into mixing, these might be some DAWs to consider. The next category is creating. And nowadays, creation is really where the DAWs are competing. Pro Tools is kind of resigned to the fact that they're always going to be the program that's for, the professional engineer. And so a lot of other programs have kind of stepped up and said, here's what we offer you. This is for creating your music. It's not just about recording and mixing it. It's about actually doing everything here, really tailored towards more of electronic music production. And for a lot of you guys who are watching this video, this is the page where you might end up finding the DAW that's right for you, because you might be more into creating that music from scratch, and it's a little bit difficult to do that with some of the programs mentioned before. Still totally possible, but that may not be their point of focus, and so you might need to purchase more plugins or download more freeware to make that work for you. So I'd say programs like Ableton Live, Logic Pro 10, the new one, if you look at that and the difference from Logic 9 to Logic Pro 10, it's totally a creation difference. They're really pushing for the person who doesn't have any experience recording and is all about kind of making something from scratch. You have FL Studio, which as far as I know is still really only working on Windows unless you have like a boot camped Mac system. Studio One, that's kind of a new thing they're trying to push a little bit, adding in synthesizers and samples and stuff. And newer kid on the block, Bitwig Studio. And then we also have Reason down there at the very bottom. At one time, Reason was really popular and really cool because it had this interface like you were in a real studio, and it had like racks, but it can't really host VST plugins. They came up with like their own format, and it doesn't work like if you own the VST. If you're going to work in Reason, you have to buy it separately. So unfortunately, they've kind of fallen to the wayside in a lot of ways, but it's still a super cool program to mess around with. And I remember using Reason when it was like version 2 or 3 when I was quite young, and just kind of screwing around, and I had a lot of fun using it. So just kind of threw that one in there. And last but not least, we have live performance. And live performance really comes down to like this whole idea of non-linear clip launching. So like you could be recording a little piano thing in, and it's going to be 4 bars. And so as you're recording that, you can hit the play button and it will play it back on a loop. And that's basically the idea behind clip launching. So you can launch a lot of things live in real time. You can manipulate things in real time and make your tracks and then actually record it out to a linear timeline. And as of right now, there's really only 2 programs that can do that. Ableton Live is very good at that. And then also Bitwig Studio, which I think in a few years, they'll also be very good at that. There are some weird glitches with that program because it's new, but with Ableton, a lot of professional musicians and performers are using that right now. If you go to a concert and you see a laptop on stage, probably 8 times out of 10, that laptop is running Ableton Live. So just as an FYI there, if live performance is something you're into. If it's not, don't even really consider it in how you're going to be making your decision. So making your choice. How do you go about choosing what's right for you? These are just a few suggestions that I would have. Again, I'm not going to say one is better than the other, but these are the ways you want to go about it. Number 1, always demo whatever that program is if they offer a demo. I'm of the mindset of if they don't offer a demo for their product, you probably don't want to use that product because it's no way being user friendly. They're like hiding it from you before you even get a chance to figure it out. A lot of times just from demoing something, you'll get the sense like, oh yeah, this is going to be the thing for me, or you'll feel a little bit more hesitant about it and you'll want to try something different. And when you want to try something different, it's probably not going to be the program for you. The other thing I'd recommend is what I call a 10-minute test. So the 10-minute test is to go on YouTube, search the DAW in whatever the most recent form is, whatever you'd be purchasing, and kind of watch somebody just working in that DAW for 10 minutes. Be kind of wary of reviews because you never really know if that review is just like a paid for review or if the person's really being honest. So you want to find somebody who works in that program. If you can do it in person, that's always the best because you can kind of ask your friend or your buddy like questions in real time. But if you can't, just go on YouTube, watch somebody working on a track. Doesn't really matter the style. You're not listening for the music that's being made, but just see what they're doing and see if it seems like it's a process that you would also enjoy just based on that program and what it is doing. Also, for making your choice, of course, budget is a consideration, and then also comfort. So something that you're going to feel very comfortable in. There are times when you can't choose comfort because you need functionality. Like if you need to perform live, for example, you can't really use something like Pro Tools, even if that's the thing that you think you'd feel most comfortable in. Or it doesn't have to be Pro Tools, it could be anything. But comfort is a big one for me because, again, this is the thing you're going to be opening every day. Who cares if it has the most features or the most samples if you just don't feel that comfortable working in it? Making your choice part 2. I'm actually just going to go ahead and read this right off the presentation. The most important thing about a DAW is that you enjoy working in it. More features doesn't equal more music. You want to try and choose the program that you think you'll make the most music in that also fits within your budget. And remember that sometimes you may not make the right choice right away. It is possible that a couple years down the road, you're really starting to get tired of working in your digital audio workstation, and so you think it's time for a change. totally okay. Don't force something if you're really not enjoying working in it or you're really feeling like you're being limited by the program. But speaking of budget, full feature DAWs can cost anywhere from $60 for a program like Reaper up to over $1,000 if you're going to get like a full Pro Tools system and get the whole box and everything. Some of these DAWs are now offering subscription plans if that's something you're into, but I think really it's all about choosing what you think is going to be right for you. And if budget is not a factor, then you really do want to consider everything and not even think about price. Just think about, what am I going to be able to make the most music in? A fairly popular question that gets asked online and that I actually see a lot of people doing, which I don't understand, is working with multiple DAWs. If you're a professional, this is a fairly common thing, and I'll give you the example as why this is fairly common. Okay, if you are working in a music studio, you're a music producer, and one day you're going to be recording a band, and then the next day, you're working on an EDM track with just a vocalist, you're going to need multiple DAWs because you're going to need that one program that's really good at recording. And then you might also find that a different program is really good when you're making that other style of music. That happens. And when that happens, it is good to have the different options. In some cases, you'll find that the same program works best for you for everything. In other ones, not so much. So there are people who really like to record in Pro Tools and then maybe mix it in Logic. That is a fairly common thing, happens all the time. But as an amateur, I'd say it's really kind of unnecessary to have those multiple DAWs because you can still accomplish everything with just the one. And it takes a decent amount of experience and years to recognize, like, okay, this one is going to be better for me here, and this one is going to be better for me here. And as a professional, you're also doing it because of time considerations and time factors. You want to be able to pick what's going to be most efficient. As an amateur, sometimes efficiency isn't always as crucial. And so it's okay if the mixing process takes you an extra 45 minutes in that other program. That's kind of one of those trade-offs that you're willing to accept as an amateur producer compared to a professional. Changing DAWs. Will a new DAW make you a better artist, producer, mix engineer, mastering engineer, sound designer, whatever? It really could. But it's usually not because the new program has more features or, built-in stuff. More likely that new program just happens to be better suited to you and how you make music. AKA, what that comes down to is you're willing to spend more time inside that program, and that could be for whatever reason. So it is okay to change DAWs, but realize that changing DAWs isn't going to suddenly make your music better the next day. It just doesn't work like that because they're all pretty much doing the same things. We all can make those same choices. It's just about what you choose to do and, again, the music you want to make. So here are a few conclusions that I have from this presentation and some things that weren't necessarily mentioned explicitly. Number one, the DAW is an investment. Really do treat it as such. Spend the time doing the demos. Spend the time watching some people just working in it. Really sit down and think about what it is you want to purchase because you are going to be sitting and working in that program a lot if you really get into making music. Most of the popular DAWs all do the same things. This isn't like one DAW is going to have a million more features than the others. Most of them can do the same things. It's just about how you accomplish it and how long it takes to set it up in some cases. More features does not equal more music. The look or feel of a DAW for some people might actually be the most important thing. And that is where it's kind of personal bias because I know that I just choose what I think is going to kind of like look the best and just has that feel to it. Because I know that then I'm going to be always kind of inspired to open up the program and work in it without being like, oh, that boring technical interface again. So that's kind of a personal thing, but I find for other people who work in the DAW a lot, that sometimes is a pretty big factor for them. And also the final thing I would say is once you do pick a DAW, try to commit to it for at least a year. Don't pick a DAW and then 2 weeks later be like, oh, I made the wrong decision. That's just your mind trying to cope with the difficulties of making music. It probably has very little to do with the DAW at that point. So stick it out for at least a year, 2 years before you consider going in a different direction.